So for the endocrine system, I have these as parts only to match what's online, particularly for the online students. So we're really going through basic hormones. We're talking about how they work, sort of that lipid soluble, water soluble story. We've got how they work, the mechanism of action. That's that. The hypothalamus, what's going to activate it, what its job is. The pituitary gland, how it gets activated, and what hormones it's going to send out, what its job is. And then individual glands beyond that, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the pancreas, the pineal gland, and then just in general what you should know about other tissues of the body that secrete hormones. So without trying to minimize going through lectures, and we can, so if we have questions or we need to dive down. So I'm just going to stick with the bullet points that we have here. So the nervous system versus the endocrine system. The only reason why that is there is just to get us as a good starting point. So in 201, we did the nervous system. It's like hardwire to control various parts of the body. The endocrine system does the same thing, just not hardwired. There's not a physical connection. It's just one gland releasing some chemicals, which are called by definition hormones, into the blood, and all they're doing is going to a receptor at another location. No different than a nerve releasing a neurotransmitter to be caught by a receptor elsewhere. So it's just two different ways, and it's a communication method that our body has. So the endocrine versus the exocrine glands. Again, that's a flashback to 201, just to sort of make sure we're key up on our terminology. Exocrine glands are glands that release their substance out into a duct that's going to go to some space. So it could be digestive enzymes, it could be acid from the stomach, it could be sweat on the surface of your skin, saliva in your mouth. The endocrine are what I just mentioned about the communication network. It's from a gland and it gets dumped right into the blood, and now it's circulating internally. So who can come up with a gland that we're talking about in this system that has both an endocrine and an exocrine function?
Pancreas.
You guys are quick. Yep, the pancreas. So the pancreas would have an exocrine function. What is its exocrine job? Digestive enzymes. So we're going to make digestive enzymes. It's going to get put out through the duct and go into the small intestine. So we'll go into that process in a lot more detail when we get to Unit 3, because that's our GI tract one. So the majority of the pancreas is dedicated to that. So as far as mass, especially when you look at the histology slides, that's most of the dark purple portion. And we'll see that when we talk about the pancreas. What is the endocrine part? That insulin and glucagon. So it's going to release those two hormones. And so it has its job there in the pancreas. So it's kind of, it could probably be put elsewhere. So that's sort of where, that's where those hormones are released from. So that's an example of a gland having two different jobs in it. So the hormone classification, water soluble versus lipid soluble. So water soluble hormones, how do they interact with a cell? Yes. On the surface of the cell. So when a water soluble hormone binds to a receptor on the surface of the cell, does it then go inside the cell? No. It stays always outside. So that hormone, the water soluble hormone, never goes into the cell at all. So then it binds the receptor on the surface of the cell, and then there's a second messenger system where that happens. You have the cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP, there's other subsets there, but suffice it to say, you have got like a whole series of little gremlins in there doing their job, working to then release some sort of, like most often, a pre-made protein, and so the response of that cell is a fairly rapid one. So a lipid-soluble hormone would function how? How does it communicate with the cell? Yeah. So it goes into the cell, it crosses the cell membrane because it's lipid-soluble, and the cell membrane is lipid-soluble, it's going to cross the cell membrane, but it will also bind to a receptor. So it's still a receptor-bound hormone. It's still going to have that connection like a lock and key. So not every what lipid-soluble hormone can come in and bind to that receptor. So the receptor is very specific for each cell for that hormone. And then what is it going to do once it combines with this receptor inside the cell for the lipid-soluble?
Into the nucleus and targets a specific section of DNA?
Yep. So it's going to go to the nucleus. It's going to read off part of the recipe in the nucleus to produce whatever it is that particular gland's in charge of making. And so it tends to be a longer process than the water-soluble response. Okay, excellent. What group, so can you name a group of hormones that would be just an easy classification for lipid soluble? Sex hormones. What are the 3 main sex hormones that we'll be just using in general for this class? Estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Yes. So an estrogen is actually a group of 3 hormones, but we'll talk about that when we do the reproductive system. So estrogen is a general name for it. So testosterone, progesterone, pretty much any hormone that ends in an "-one". So estrogen, one of it is estrone actually. So it's sort of, but the estrogen is sort of just the group's name. So those are the main sex hormones. So rather than have you memorize just a list of which one's water, which one's lipid soluble, for your exam, if I were to refer to progesterone or estrogen or testosterone and say the receptor for testosterone is found where? And I'm looking to you to mentally think it's a lipid soluble, therefore it's going to be inside the cell. If I were to contrast that, cut and paste a question and say the surface receptors would bind to which of the following, and then I've got estrogen and testosterone, progesterone, and then I throw in insulin, and then my surface, okay, that eliminates those 3, must be then insulin. So if I really want you to focus on how they work, and then those would be the 3 that would be the representatives of lipid soluble. But I do want your consciousness to be aware that there are many more. So any of the ONs, all of the adrenal cortex hormones, for instance, would classify as lipid soluble. So there are many of them, but just for your exam, I'll utilize those 3 in reference. So for the location action of the hypothalamus and pituitary, where's the hypothalamus located at? Below the thalamus. That's right. So we have, here's the thalamus, here's this one circled is the hypothalamus. Its relationship to the pituitary is this narrow stalk. That stalk is mandibulum, and then this is the pituitary. So the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, they have a relationship together. So for the hypothalamus, what is it sensing? Where does it get its marching orders from? What information is coming into the hypothalamus that would cause it to then do something? Kind of more of a broad question. Yeah, so really so I was kind of thinking big picture. So it's really from the whole body. From the whole body, you've got all kinds of information that the hypothalamus is detecting and receiving. And then if there's something amiss or something awry or out of balance, it then says, hey, I need to then enact some sort of other hormones to get things done, which then it communicates with the pituitary gland to then do that. So the pituitary gland, so I just want to point this out as in contrast. The hypothalamus gets information from the whole body, but the pituitary gland only gets information from the hypothalamus. So although the pituitary gland is going to send out hormones that impact and have a direct effect throughout the body, it's only getting marching orders from the hypothalamus. And so it's really just got this chain of command, whereas the hypothalamus is receiving all kinds of information. So there's that. How does the hypothalamus control the pituitary gland? So there's 2 ways. So there is the hypophyseal portal system, which is a blood system. It sends hormones, sort of like doing a little mail messenger. Puts a little hormone within this hypophyseal portal system that will then get picked up by the anterior pituitary. When the hypothalamus puts a hormone into the hypophyseal portal system, male system, what words would you identify as this is a hormone coming from the hypothalamus? Yeah, so the word, whatever hormone the hypothalamus wants the pituitary gland to release or to send out to the body, the hypothalamus will send a hormone that will have the term releasing or the term inhibiting in that. So it could be, if the intention is for the pituitary gland to send out luteinizing hormone, the hypothalamus would send a luteinizing releasing hormone. If there is enough luteinizing hormone that's gone out and its effect is brought brought back to normal, then the hypothalamus will send out a luteinizing inhibiting hormone. So if you see any hormone name with the term releasing or inhibiting in it, you know that it originated from the hypothalamus and its target will be the anterior pituitary. Not throughout the body, but its target is the anterior pituitary. Okay, the posterior pituitary, how does it communicate with the posterior? Thank you. Nerves, direct nerve connection. So, and there's only 2 hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary, and they really do come out the end of the nerve as then released. So it's a bit different. It's not really as a gland, but it's still releasing it directly into the blood. Okay. So let's go through what the 2 hormones of the posterior pituitary are. Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. What does antidiuretic hormone do? Don't pee hormone. So it targets the kidneys and tells the kidneys retain water. And what it does is it concentrates the urine. So it reduces the amount of water that's excreted out the urine. What about oxytocin? What is the role of that? Uterine contraction. Yes, so it will target smooth muscle. The smooth muscle along the ducts through the mammary gland. So it's causing the delivery of milk. It's not affecting the production of milk, not the glandular components of the mammary glands, but actually the delivery of milk, so milk ejection. And then it targets the smooth muscle of the uterus for baby ejection out of the body, if you want. So for labor. So that was the, it has a number of other roles. Those would be the 2 sort of main ones that you can kind of hang your hat on for purposes of this. So now we have how many hormones are being released from the anterior pituitary? 6. There's 7 that's in there, but we're talking about 6. So let's go through them. Who wants to talk about the first one? The name, thyroid stimulating hormone. So if we have thyroid stimulating hormone, and I'm noticing, so this is a do as I say, not as I do moment. Okay, so I'm writing an abbreviation, but on your test, you will not be doing that. You can do it if you write what TSH equals somewhere else and then like point that out like a key if you want to, but otherwise if it's just an abbreviation with no other area explaining that I know that you know what the letters actually stand for, then it will be marked wrong or at least half off. Okay, so I'm just pointing that out. So thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland is going to target what? The thyroid. So let's go on to the thyroid. And since this is a review, you should know what part of the thyroid are the cells that have receptors for thyroid stimulating located. So what part of the thyroid is it targeting? Now, so remember there was 2 cell types that you needed to know when we looked at the histology of the thyroid gland. There you go. So it's actually going to target follicular cells. And then those guys are going to then do what? Release T3 and T4. So I want to point this out. When, for the purpose of our test, when I ask a test question, if I were to ask what is the effect of thyroid stimulating hormone, it is not to release T3, T4. Ultimately, that happens in the scheme of things. So for any hormone, I just want to know what the next stop is. So its job is to tell the thyroid, to tell the follicular cells in particular, to release T3, T4. The action of T3, T4 is its own job. So the job of T3, T4 as the next hormone set would then be to increase metabolism. So the job of the thyroid stimulating hormone is to just tell follicular cells to release it. The job of these cells and this hormone is to then boost metabolism for the body. So that makes that distinction make sense? Okay. What's the next hormone? Okay. So we'll do follicle, our first of our gonadotropin, follicle stimulating hormone. What is its target? Yep, so it's our gonads, which would be ovaries and testes. And what do we want them to do?
Release gamete production.
Gamete production. Which would be egg or sperm production. Okay. What's the other gonadotropin? Luteinizing hormone. Okay. And its target is also the ovaries and testes. But what is the job of luteinizing hormone? Yes, so we have, for the luteinizing hormone's job is to have the sex hormones produced. That would be estrogen or testosterone. Okay. What's the next hormone? It's another hormone from the pituitary, anterior pituitary. Prolactin. Its target? Mammary glands. Its job? Milk production, yep. Lactation, so that's its name. Prolactin, it's named prolactation. Okay, another one. This one's the big word. Adreno. It's telling you, it's giving you a hint. It's trying to make up for its having such a long name. It's trying to give you lots of hints in its name. Not one they can use in the test, but yeah, ACTH. Yes. So adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it's telling you, what's a tropic? What does that mean? Target. So you might be able to like do a blood sample in the back of your calf and pull out blood from there and say, I got adrenocorticotropic hormone around here. Is it doing anything over there? Nope, because there's only receptors. It's tropic in that there's only receptors in the adrenal cortex for it. Specifically, the middle zona, which is cortisol is going to release, but do you remember zona fasciculata? Yep. So it'll be in that if we're getting fancy here. But for here, adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to the adrenal cortex. And it's going to release cortisol, our stress hormone. Okay. What's our next one? Growth hormone. All right, that's our last one. So our last one here, growth hormone. And where is it going? Everywhere. So it's not a tropic hormone. It's going to have a lot of places that it's going to have action. And we'll make our lives a little bit easy here and we'll just say growth. Yay. So pretty much, except we're going to go a couple. There's a little bit, because this was so easy, I just couldn't leave it at that. So what if we have too much, excessive amounts of growth hormone as an adult? What condition would you have? Acromegaly. Acromegaly, because you're just getting the growth stimulus, but it's going to, you're not able to grow taller, so you're actually growing more of the soft tissues, and it could progress. Usually it's the result of a tumor in the pituitary gland that hypersecretes it. What if someone had a hypersecretion of growth hormone, a prepubescent person? And I say prepubescent because it's not about sexual development, but it's about the point of puberty, the point where you go from a child to a potentially reproducing adult. The body's priorities in terms of its energy expenditure changes. So that's when it says, you know what, the priority isn't so much to worry about getting taller. We have the potential, specifically in females, to direct our attention to a growing fetus. So therefore, at the point of puberty, mostly the epiphyseal plates are initiated to close, and that will be the onset, the stopping of their growth. Kids with growth plates that are still present, what would be the effect of a hypersecretion of growth hormone? Giantism. What would be the effect of an inadequate secretion of growth hormone? Pituitary dwarfism. But yes, it'll be dwarfism, but you have to classify it as pituitary. Otherwise, there are a number of other types of dwarfism that are more chromosomally related. So there was a question about, it was a good question, is about a feedback loop. And I do want you to know a feedback loop for a hormone. So I could name a hormone, whether it's an anterior pituitary hormone that we have listed here. So I'll use one of these as an example since it's already written on the board. It could be a non-anterior pituitary hormone or pituitary. It could be just like insulin, just from the pancreas out. It could be, so I will pick a hormone and I will ask you, because I'm just assuming for all the hormones, you just know where it comes from and what its job is. So in any of those, you should be able to come up with a negative feedback loop of what would turn it on, what is it going to do, and then whatever it fixes, it comes back and turns it off. So that's really what I'm looking for any of the hormones. So we'll go through this. So let's do luteinizing hormone. What would be the stimulus if I were to say draw or describe a negative feedback loop for luteinizing hormone? You would want to start with something, what would be low, what would we have low levels of that would cause us to need more luteinizing hormone, for example? So if we'll say low testosterone. So if we got a sex hormone, you can say low testosterone. Low testosterone levels are detected by what? Excellent, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus detects low testosterone levels. So what does the hypothalamus do? Sends out luteinizing releasing hormone, which then goes to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary sends out luteinizing hormone. So now that's heading out to the body. Where is its target in the body? This will be the gonads, and if we're dealing with testosterone as being the level, go to the testes. The testes then increase more testosterone. The hypothalamus detects normal, adequate levels of testosterone, sends out luteinizing inhibiting hormone, and then the anterior pituitary ceases to send out luteinizing hormone. And then it's turned off again. Let's do like an easy one that would be glucagon from the pancreas. If we were to say, describe the negative feedback loop for glucagon, what would be the original stimulus that would tell the pancreas that we need glucagon released in the first place? Low blood glucose. So all of a sudden you're hungry, you're between meals, your blood glucose levels are really low. Your pancreas, you want to get real fancy and go, oh, the alpha cells of the islet of Langerhans, kind of whip out your terminology there, will then release glucagon. Glucagon then causes blood glucose levels to increase. Normal blood glucose levels tell the alpha cells in the pancreas, stop releasing glucagon, and just turns it off.
So can we just write that in a paragraph? Or do we get, okay.
You can write it in a paragraph, you can write it as bullet points, however you want to. So you can draw a picture, like little, I'm just looking for benchmarks. Okay, they know that glucagon is stimulated because it was low glucose, because its job was to raise glucose. So it's like obviously the opposite of what it does. They know that it came from the gland. Oh, wow, they even knew the cell that it came from in the gland or the part of the cell. And then it's released, it does its job, so you know that it's gonna actually raise blood glucose. And then you remembered that bringing it back to normal turned it right back off. That completes the circle. So just, those are sort of benchmarks. So however you wanna do it, pictorially, bullet points, nice essay, any of that, it's fine. Usually I'm going through and I'm just circling them as I see them. So if we do, let's do the parathyroid first. The parathyroid gland sends out which hormone?
Oh, parathyroid.
Parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. We got a lot of paras here, so this is where the confusion can often arise. What is the job of parathyroid hormone? Yes. So the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone, which increases blood calcium levels. So parathyroid gland makes parathyroid hormone, which increases blood calcium levels. So since we're on the blood calcium story, what would decrease blood calcium levels? Right, calcitonin. And where does calcitonin come from? The thyroid gland. Okay, so that's the yin and yang with regards to calcium. But the thyroid gland also does sends out some other hormones, which would be, it sends out T3. Who can tell me what T3 really is? Triiodothyronine. Perfect. And T4, tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine. Okay. T3, T4, what is their purpose? Increased metabolism. Now we're going to add some cells. Since we're not looking at the histology of the parathyroid gland, you do need to know the histology of the thyroid gland. So what are the cells that produces calcitonin in the thyroid gland? Parafollicular cells. They're also known as C cells, yes. Now the either one, they'll both be right. For the T3, T4, what cells release those? Follicular cells, yeah. Feeling good about that? Okay. Location, histology of the thyroid. So if we're looking at the histology of the thyroid gland, what are the follicular cells and what are the parafolliculars? Where are we going to find those? We're going to look, what are we going to see? So we have follicular cells in this image. We can see they are the ones that form the circle in this more zoomed in image, or you can see all of the circles here. And where are parafollicular cells or C cells located? They are in these outside little corners. So they're going to be not part of these circles. They're out in the adjacent space. What is normal T3? What is the action of normal T3? Increased metabolism, like we have here. What about this reverse T3? It is a unique situation where high levels of stress actually cause the T4 to have a different iodine cleaved off. So it still makes T3, but it is a different T3 that actually serves to reduce metabolism. So it's not a common situation, but it's something that you should be aware of. So for the purpose of the exam, normal T3 is intended for increasing metabolism. Reverse T3 decreases metabolism. Thyroid pathology, what I have here is kind of meant for you to think about the goiter. We can have goiters due to hyperthyroidism. The thyroid gland just got really, really big because it's asked to keep producing a whole lot of T3 and T4. So the body will have this hyperthyroid symptomology. It's going to have symptoms of racing heart, person's going to be really warm, their cells are being driven, their mitochondria is being increasing ATP production. So there's a lot of activity that's going on in this hyperthyroid state. Those people will have bug eyes because their eyes will be bulging due to the inflammation of the muscles of their eyes, have a goiter. Other people can have goiters as well, and that the thyroid gland is producing a lot of product, but in those people, their symptoms could be hypothyroid symptoms, in that what's being produced from the thyroid is defunct. In those cases, it's an iodine deficiency goiter. They don't have enough iodine, so they might be making T2. Well, the cells are like, I can't do anything with this. And so the order goes back in through the hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid stimulating hormone. We need more T3, T4. So it goes through that. It gets it. It's not what it needs. So it sends the order in. And meanwhile, the thyroid gland continues to increase in size because it's continually being asked to produce T3, T4. The body just doesn't have enough iodine to make useful T3, T4, but the thyroid just keeps churning it out more. So that's where the goiter comes from. It's just overproduction. So that's there. And we talked about activation and inactivation with regards to whatever these effects are. So that, again, that's just your negative feedback loop. If I were to say, tell me a negative feedback loop for parathyroid hormone, what would you start off with? What would be the stimulus? Low blood calcium would tell the parathyroid gland, release parathyroid hormone. Blood calcium levels, pulls it out from the bones. Blood calcium levels rise. Turn it off the release. So that would be kind of an example of that. Any questions? All right.
Turn off the release, are you saying use calcium or just
No, it would just stop the parathyroid. Because it would. So this one's going to be simple. It would be if you had low blood calcium, tell parathyroid hormone to get out there. Parathyroid hormone is released. It will pull blood calcium from the reservoirs, which are the bones. Blood calcium levels rise back up. That's a stimulus that stops the release of parathyroid. No more releasing. And then later, so you're sort of flat, plateau, you're in the normal range, but then if later you have drops it again, it'll kick it back out. Or if you ate a bunch of calcium or somehow you had a high consumption and blood calcium levels went, that's it. So it's not like this is turning it off. It would just be this is its own independent. Exactly. Okay, so for the adrenal gland, let's do that one first. The adrenal gland, we'll look at this. So you have the middle portion, and we know it's the medulla, but you need to call it the adrenal medulla because there's medullas in other places of the body. Medulla is just a term that sort of refers to the middle. Cortex is a term that refers to the outside. So we have lots of cortexes and medullas throughout. You need to be specific. So this is the adrenal medulla. What hormones does the adrenal medulla release? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. What is the job of epinephrine and norepinephrine? Or what is its action? It is the fight or flight response. It's part of our autonomic nervous system for our sympathetic nervous system portion. And so when the adrenal medulla is asked to send out epinephrine and norepinephrine to go throughout the whole body, it will target alpha and beta receptors, if you guys recall this from before, different than alpha and beta cells. That was the different things. Alpha beta receptors, which will then do things like dilate your pupils, increase your heart rate, increase the force of contractility, so you're sending out more blood, open up airways, so you're bringing in more, you're able to oxygenate blood more efficiently. So anything's going to help you run away from something or respond, flight or fight. Now the cortex is obviously out here. So this is the adrenal cortex. On a histology slide, you will only have to name adrenal medulla or adrenal cortex, but you're going to need to know more information about the adrenal cortex. So let's start here with the adrenal cortex. What is the outermost zona? And in order to name it correctly, you have to have the name, the name zona with it. So zona glomerulosa, yes. What is the family of hormones that the zona glomerulosa produces? Excellent, mineralocorticoids. What's the main mineralocorticoid that we would have? What's the name of the hormone? Aldosterone, excellent. Mhm. Okay. Next, zona. Zona fasciculata. What family of hormones does it produce? Glucocorticoids. What's the main one out of this group? Cortisol, that's our main stress hormone. Where the mineralocorticoids have an impact on fluid balances and mineral balances throughout our body, blood pressure primarily. The glucocorticoids have an impact on our immune system as well as stress and metabolism in the sense of glucose utilization. Okay. What is our third zona and our innermost zona? Zona reticularis. And what family of hormones does it produce? Sex hormones. They tend to be more on the androgen side of things. So what would be the main one? Testosterone. Okay. So on a histology diagram, you would only need to identify the adrenal medulla, which would be the middle portion, or the adrenal cortex, which would be if I'm pointing anywhere out here. It's just too difficult to discern exactly where one zona begins, the other ends. But then you will have a follow-up question that asks you to describe the zona, probably, you know, from superficial to deep, family of hormones that zona produces, as well as the primary hormone from that family. So you definitely need to know that on the practical portion, as well as a series of questions that are going to be on the Scantron or the multiple choice portion. So a question in that context might be, what is the main hormone produced by the zona fasciculata? Or mineralocorticoids come from which zona? So the pancreas, where is the pancreas located? Sort of underneath, below the stomach. Yes. And then it's got a wider end, it's like a feather, like a wider end, that's the head, and it tapers off to a tail. We're going to spend more time on the pancreas, on the digestive components of the pancreas when we do Unit 3. So for the pancreas, we have histology, we have an exocrine and endocrine, which we spoke about earlier. The exocrine portion, so if we have the pancreas here, the exocrine portion of the pancreas is called what? Acinine, that's right. And what does it do? Release digestive enzymes. Okay. And the endocrine portion is called what? Pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. Islet of Langerhans. They have two sets of cells. The first set of cells will be alpha. Alpha cells release what? Glucagon. What does glucagon do? Increases blood glucose. Okay. And it's got beta cells. Beta cells produce what? Insulin, yeah. Would glucagon and insulin be a water-soluble hormone or a lipid-soluble hormone? Water-soluble. So therefore, the receptors, when they're going to do their job, are going to be located where on cells? Outside the cell on the surface. And what is the job of insulin? Decreases blood glucose. So after a meal, so you had maybe between classes, you had a bag of jelly beans. So your blood glucose levels are going to rise. Beta cells in the islet of Langerhans, the pancreas, sense high levels of blood glucose, sends out insulin. Insulin first goes to all the cells, sends any glucose in, so the cells can utilize that glucose, produce energy. If you have additional glucose that's still remaining in the blood, then it goes to the liver and tells the liver, could we store some of this glucose? We have got to get it out of the blood. My job is to reduce it, get it out of the blood. So the liver will take on some and store some of the glucose as glycogen. That's sort of like the pantry of the body. And then if you still have even more blood glucose, because it was a really big bag of jelly beans and you were really hungry, then the body has to store it even further in longer term storage, which would be your fat deposits. So that's sort of the order sequence that you have there. Then you're in the middle of class, it's a really long class, you're listening to me natter on for a really long time, and then your blood glucose levels get really low. So, and actually after we put it in storage, our blood glucose levels got normal, which went back to the beta cells and they stopped selling that insulin. And then you're just fine for a while. And then again, now in the class, I'm talking, getting really hungry after a while. So then you have low blood glucose levels, getting sleepy. What happens? Your alpha cells sense that, glucagon gets kicked out. Glucagon says, I need to raise our blood glucose levels. Hey, liver, you know that stuff we stored? Remember glycogen that we stored earlier after the bag of jelly beans? We need to break it down so that we have now blood glucose levels to get us through till we can go get some lunch later. So it raises your blood glucose levels back to normal levels, and then that will then turn off until it drops again or until you get more food and you have this story going on. Who can tell me what type 1 diabetes is? It's an autoimmune disease. It means your own immune system decides these guys are bad. It decides to just nix out beta cells, and then your body has a really hard time making insulin. What is type 2 diabetes? Yes, because you've just exposed your body repeatedly over and over many years of insulin because of high glucose levels. So glucose levels, insulin gets released, the receptor sees it, binds to it, lets the glucose in the cell. After a while, it's like, insulin, it's you again, and it just ignores it. And so then the beta cells send out even more insulin because, well, the blood glucose levels are still high. So it sends out more. And so you're having to produce a huge amount of insulin over time to get your blood glucose levels to go down because they're so desensitized. What is the best way to resensitize insulin receptors? Exercise. Specific diet plays a role. Fasting can play a role. Exercise, there's not a pill in the market that can have a greater impact on resensitization of insulin receptors, because when you have a cell that says, oh, maybe I need that glucose because I got to go for a walk around the park and I need to make energy. It's a different story when you're just exposing yourselves to glucose and you're just sitting there and you have no energy output. But as soon as your body needs energy and is utilizing it by going for a walk, the signal from within the cell to the receptors say, hey, I do want to listen to insulin. Yeah, bring in the glucose. There is not a drug on the market that can exceed the resensitization that exercise can induce in these receptors. That's why it has to be a part of anyone's management and hopeful recovery from that. And it is recoverable. Type 2 diabetes takes many years for onset, but it is a recoverable condition. Okay, pineal gland. Pineal gland, where is it located? It's in the brain. So remember where we had the hypothalamus and the thalamus. So this is my really bad picture of the brain. So I'm gonna do a little brain, okay, brain. Ooh, really sad person. Here's cerebellum back here, really pathetic, sorry. Here's brain. So if we had our thalamus here, remember our hypothalamus is right here, and the pineal gland sits in the epithalamus. Kind of has cells that are up on top, but then there's a large bulbous head towards the back. So that's really where the pineal gland is located. It's known as the third eye because it is sensitive to light. If the pineal gland is sensitive to light, and it releases melatonin, the pineal gland releases melatonin in response to the absence of light. So in the absence of light or darkness, melatonin is released. one of the effects of melatonin is actually to head on over and influence growth hormone production. And therefore you have a greater surge of growth hormone production when melatonin is released. Melatonin also is a major brain antioxidant. Most people are most aware, and its main consideration is circadian rhythms, sleep, wake cycles, sort of those kinds of things. So it has a much greater impact on animals in terms of hair in the winter, hibernation, those kind of things. For human, it kind of is our sleep-wake cycle, but people take supplemental melatonin. They never should do it for very long. It's meant to help with an adjustment period. It's not meant to be considered as a daily supplement. So what to know for the pineal gland, the location in the brain, epithalamus, top part of the diencephalon. It produces melatonin in the absence of light. Melatonin affects circadian rhythm. It affects day-night cycle. It has an impact on growth hormone and growth, particularly in kids. So that's kind of just where you need to be with that. We don't need to know any more beyond that. Other organs and tissues, I don't care that you know the exact hormones coming from other organs and tissues, but I do want you to know that there are other things that are in different systems. It's not part of the endocrine system, but still release chemicals into the blood and by definition, release hormones. The heart, for one, releases one. Fat releases. The digestive system has loads of hormones that the GI tract, that it releases. Kidneys, we think of the kidneys as filtering blood and making pee. It also releases hormones. Kidney releases hormones that actually increase our blood cell production. So they have weird little side jobs that have an endocrine type function. So what I want you to do is just be aware that the endocrine system technically is not limited to just what we've covered. There are other sources of blood-borne hormones, and that is redundant because the term hormone just implies it's blood-borne anyway. So any question from here might be, like which of the following produce hormones? And I might put the heart and the guts and fat, and then you'd be like all of the above, pretty much. So that you're just aware, but I'm not going to ask at all what those are. We haven't gone through them, and I will talk about them as needed. For instance, the heart one, even though we did the heart in this unit, we're going to talk about the heart hormone in the next unit because it impacts blood pressure. I want to do vessels and blood pressure. So we will be coming across them, but just not as part of the endocrine system. But I just want at this point your awareness to be not limited to the endocrine system. Okay, so we're going to do the heart review now. We'll go through the first part, the external anatomy. For the external anatomy, you need to know the two layers of the pericardium. The layer that is touching the surface of the heart is the visceral pericardium. It is fused with the epicardium, which is the outermost of the three layers of the heart. The other layer that you actually see that you would have to cut through if you were going to do surgery and open up the chest and see that the heart's contained in a sac, that is the parietal pericardial sac. The surface of the heart features that you should know. If you're looking at the heart, the first feature that you would want to identify would be the pulmonary trunk. It's going to be the most anterior of the great vessels. Once you see that pulmonary trunk, you can then have identified the anterior surface of the heart. Immediately behind that would be the aorta. Now that you would know front and back, you should then be able to identify the right atrium and the left atrium. And then the location of the right and left ventricles. You should then also identify the pointy inferior portion, which is the apex. You should be able to see the vessels that are bringing blood into the right atrium, namely the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And the left atrium, the vessels leading to that, are the pulmonary veins. On the posterior aspect of the heart, you should see the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is a large, this looks like a large wide vein, because all of the veins of used up blood from the heart are draining into this coronary sinus, which then delivers blood straight back into the right atrium. You'll also see coronary arteries. But on the hearts that we've dissected in class, you won't need to identify them on that. There'll be images of the heart for the online students that you will have to identify coronary arteries. The muscular layers of the heart has three main layers. The outermost layer is known as the epicardium. It is fused with the visceral pericardium. Then there is the myocardium. It is the vast majority of the heart tissue. It is the contractile cells of the heart. Then the innermost layer that's actually touching the blood, that's lining the chambers, is known as the endocardium. Next, we'll go through the coronary arteries. The only coronary arteries that you'll need to know are the right coronary artery. The right coronary artery really just serves the right side of the heart. So that one's as straightforward as it can be. We're not going to learn any of the smaller arterial branches from there. Then we have the left main coronary artery, and that doesn't serve any specific one region of the heart. It divides immediately to become the left circumflex artery, which will bring blood to the lateral portion and posterior portion of the left ventricle. The left main coronary artery will also divide into the left anterior descending artery, most commonly referred to as the LAD. Some textbooks are more frequently referring to it as the anterior interventricular artery. This will serve the anterior surface of the left ventricle. So of these three arteries, the right coronary artery, left circumflex, and the left anterior descending, you are responsible for the region of the heart that it will deliver oxygen to. You also should know that the left main coronary artery, that as well as the right coronary arteries, are the two branches off of the aorta. The left main is just a centimeter or two long before it divides into these two. The drainage of the used up blood from the heart will come back through the coronary veins. I don't have you know any of the specific coronary veins that we have. Just know that all of the coronary veins, all of the deoxygenated blood from the heart return to the coronary sinus, and then that has an opening directly into the right atrium. The internal cardiac anatomy. You should know the four chambers of the heart: right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. The left ventricle will have a very, very thick wall because the left ventricle ejects blood to the aorta and out to the whole body. So it requires a greater amount of force than the wall of the right ventricle, which sends blood a very short distance to the lower pressure lungs. So the wall, visually, you can identify the left ventricle by the vast thickness of the musculature that makes the ventricle. Between the atria and the ventricle are atrioventricular valves. So they divide the atria from the ventricle. We have a right atrioventricular valve, and we have a left atrioventricular. These also have other names. The right atrioventricular valve is also known as the tricuspid valve. The left atrioventricular valve is also known as the bicuspid valve. The left atrioventricular valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, has a third name known as the mitral valve. These valves have features inside the ventricles. There'll be portions of musculature that come up from the ventricular walls that will attach to strings that go to the flaps. The strings are known as chordae tendineae, and the muscle portions that come up are known as papillary muscles. You will see them both in the right ventricle as well as the left ventricle. These features, chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles, are exclusive to the atrioventricular valves. The pathway of blood flow is such that blood from the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava enter the right atrium. Comes in, this right atrioventricular valve will be open, so blood will continue into the right ventricle. This blood is deoxygenated. It is the used up blood that is just returning from the upper and lower body. The right ventricle, when it contracts, it will send blood out of the right ventricle, out through the pulmonary trunk to the right and left pulmonary arteries to the lungs. That blood will get oxygenated and return back to the left atria via the pulmonary veins. That will be open. Blood will go down into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, it will squeeze and send blood out the aorta and out through the whole body. The left side of the heart will have oxygenated blood. So the two valves that we've already done, the right and left atrioventricular valves that are within the chambers of the heart. To prevent backflow back into the heart after the ventricles have ejected blood out to the lungs or to the body, we don't want that blood to come back. So when the right ventricle ejects blood, it pushes open the pulmonary semilunar valve, and when the right ventricle relaxes, blood won't come back into the right ventricle, but will shut that pulmonary semilunar valve. The left side is contracting, the left ventricle ejects blood out across the aortic semilunar valve when it's wide open, and then when the left ventricle relaxes, that aortic semilunar valve will shut. Both the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves have no chordae tendineae, and they have no papillary muscles. They're only the cusps. And the closure of those valves will also make a sound. So the heart sounds are because of valve closure. The timing of them would occur first from the two atrioventricular valves slamming shut at the onset of ventricular contraction, and then you'll have another heart sound with the two semilunar valves slamming shut at the end of ejection. For electrophysiology, we're going to talk about electrode placement. We will not be doing the chest leads. The placement of the electrodes, we have one on each shoulder and each hip. It could be extrapolated to each wrist and each ankle. It essentially makes a box around the heart. The one at the right hip is a ground and is not used in the three main leads that we will be talking about. So the lead in this context is a pair of electrodes. Lead 1 will be about, for instance, from the right shoulder to the left shoulder. That would be one lead. And lead 2 would be another pair, and lead 3 is another pair here. So the placement of these recording electrodes are such that it will surround the heart so it can detect electrical activity or electrical waves that are traveling through the heart. It's picking them up. It detects if you have, say, a negative electrode on this side and a positive electrode on this side, and we have the heart. This is my hideous oval heart here. If, in this case, the sinoatrial node, you have depolarization across the heart in this direction, it's going towards a positive electrode, so you're going to record it as a positive blip. If you were to have a repolarizing, which is a negative wave going to a positive electrode, you would have it as a negative deflection on the chart paper. If, for instance, you're traveling down the interventricular septum, if you still consider this side as being positive, you're still getting closer and closer to the positive side, so you're going to see that as a positive deflection or a positive wave. You will need to know the conducting portions of the heart. Where is the pacemaker? What is the pacemaker of the heart? The pacemaker of the heart is known as the sinoatrial node. Sinoatrial node is in the upper back wall of the right atrium. When it depolarizes, it initiates the electrical signal, and that wave will depolarize the right atrium followed by the left atrium. So it makes a nice right to left wave or progression of electrical depolarization that will be picked up on by your electrodes. The backup pacemaker is known as the atrioventricular node. It is located at the bottom portion of the right atrium, right in conjunction near the top portion, the top narrow portion of the interventricular septum. So it acts as a relay station to bring the depolarizing impulse that's within the atria down into the one electrical region that the electrical pathway is allowed to go to, down into the ventricles. So the atrioventricular node is also considered the backup pacemaker because if the sinoatrial node is not working, the atrioventricular node is able to initiate a beat. It then goes down the bundle of His, which is in the upper narrow portion of the interventricular septum. Then it goes into, it splits down because where the interventricular septum gets very, very thick, it has to have two separate electrical pathways. So you'd have a right bundle branch and a left bundle branch. Ultimately going down to the apex, back up the interventricular septum and around to the outer free walls will be Purkinje fibers. Those are the ones that are actually getting the myocardial cells, the contractile cells, to actually get them to initiate a beat. These others are more just like a wire pathway going down. So they're not activating the adjacent muscles. It's really the Purkinje fibers themselves that are causing the activation of the cardiac muscle. So now that we know the pathway, the electrical pathway, and you should be able to identify these on a diagram. Once we know the sequence of what's happening through the heart, once we know the sequence of what's happening in terms of depolarization order, then we can interpret the electrocardiogram. So when the sinoatrial node depolarizes the right atrium and then the left atrium, we see that as a positive wave known as the P wave. The P wave represents atrial depolarization. The electrical signal gets to the atrioventricular node, travels straight down that bundle of His, the bundle branches going straight down the interventricular septum. So we're going to see this as it's going up to this spike, back to the bottom of the apex, and back up and around to the ventricular free walls. That is going to be known as the QRS complex. So that represents ventricular depolarization. Depolarization is not contraction. Depolarization is the signal to cause contraction. So the contraction event happens after depolarization. In fact, it happens during the flat line here. Then when the ventricle is relaxing and repolarizing, we would have this T wave. This represents ventricular repolarization. So you should be able to not only identify the regions, the electrical active regions of the heart, sinoatrial node, atrioventricular node, bundle of His, right and left bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers, and knowing that sequence, you should also know about the P wave, what the QRS complex, and the T wave, what each one of those represents. P wave is all about action, depolarization, the signal to tell the atria to contract. The QRS is the signal, the depolarizing signal, the activating signal, if you want to think of it that way, of the ventricles telling it to contract. And then the T wave, repolarization, a rebalancing of the ions across the membrane of these cardiac myocytes. So the P wave is an electrical activity, but the action, the atrial contraction happens after. QRS is ventricular depolarization, so the actual contraction of the ventricles is happening after. So we'll finish this electrical portion up with a little quick review of the cardiac action potential. So if you recall, the action potential, we measure them in millivolts. A resting membrane potential is very, very negative. When a cell is going to depolarize, so if we have this here as a cell, cardiac myocyte, it's normally very negative inside compared to how positive is on the outside. On the outside, we have loads of sodium. On the inside, we have lots of potassium. There's also potassium outside, and there's also sodium inside. But the higher concentration of sodium is outside, higher concentration of potassium is inside. When a cardiac muscle cell is normally at a very negative level, anywhere below minus 70 to minus 90, in fact, when sodium channels open, sodium will enter the cell and make it very positive. So if we're looking at a chart, we can see this, it becoming going away from negative. So it's becoming more and more positive. This is known as depolarization. It's due to sodium influx into the cell. At the peak, at about plus 30 millivolts, the sodium channels will close and no more sodium will enter the cell. And now the cell's very positive. The cell wants to become more negative. So the cell will open up at plus 30 potassium channels and let potassium leave. When potassium leaves, we see that we start to repolarize. In a neuron, potassium would continue to leave and the repolarization would bring the cell back down to its normal negative resting state. But since we're talking about cardiac cells, a little extra thing happens. Is at the same time that potassium is leaving the cell, we open up calcium gates and we actually allow calcium. Calcium is a positive ion. So you have a positive ion potassium leaving, you have a positive ion calcium entering the cell. So the two positive ions are crossing, and so they are not making any net voltage changes. So during the time that calcium is entering the cell, potassium is also leaving the cell. So the voltage does not change. This is known as the plateau phase. Finally, calcium channels close. No more calcium is coming in, and therefore the potassium that's leaving is then able to bring the cell back to negative and cause repolarization, which is potassium efflux. That means potassium exiting the cell. So this plateau phase is unique to cardiac cells. The reason for this is that it causes the action potential to be of such a great duration that it forces the cardiac cells, when they contract, to allow them to have a relaxation, initiate a relaxation phase before another contraction is allowed to come. That is not the case for nerve stimulation of skeletal muscles. We want to have contractions. If we want to hold something steady, we're going to hold, say, this microphone case right here in my hand and not just be twitching it. We want to hold it steady. So I would have a nerve impulse coming down to my bicep over and over and over again to maintain a steady state contraction. We never want our heart to do that. Never. So we never want our heart to just squeeze and beat and just keep squeezing. So we want relaxation to occur. By having this, no matter how quickly our heart may be being stimulated, it will not be stimulated more quickly, more rapidly to allow contraction. It will actually force a relaxation between each one. Okay, for the cardiac cycle, let's just do this one real quick. You should be able to draw the cardiac cycle. You'll see, you'll be given a wave, say one that looks like this. What wave would this be? This one is pressure of the left ventricle. It's going to be in millimeters of mercury are the units for this. So here we're going to start at 0. Let's label this. Put this here at 200. Okay. The easiest way to get through this drawing and to be able to draw other drawings, I'm going to ask you to draw the volume. I'm going to ask you to draw the electrocardiogram. I'm also going to ask you to do some calculations. So I'm going to give you a heart rate. Let's say the heart rate is going to be 60 beats a minute. Give you end diastolic volume is going to be, say, 150 milliliters. We'll have end systolic volume. Put that at 50 milliliters. Then I'm going to have you answer some questions. You're going to calculate this person's stroke volume. You're going to calculate this person's cardiac output. And you're going to tell me what this person's blood pressure is. We're also going to draw all the waves first. When I start this off, I'll do this. I'll look here and I'll draw the points on the graph that I know valve activity is going to occur. So there's going to be a dot here, and a dot here. There's going to be a dot here, and a dot here. Those 4 dots are representing valve activity. So let's name this first one. This one is going to be the atrioventricular valve is going to close. This one is going to be the aortic semilunar valve will open. This one over here is the aortic semilunar valve will close again. And then down here, we're going to finally open up the atrioventricular valve will open. Once we have all these valves figured out, then we can identify this phase. The phase between when the atrioventricular valve closes, but the semilunar valve is not open yet. So that means they're both closed. This is known as isovolumic contraction. And likewise, from the point that that semilunar valve closes, but we have yet to open the atrioventricular valve again, this will be known as isovolumic relaxation. And it will be this distance. So we see them as going up and down on the pressure graph. However, on the volume graph, they will be flat lines. So let's draw the volume graph now. So if we do the volume of the left ventricle, and it will be in milliliters, so that's a volume. I'm going to draw these dots. So this first dot, I'm going to make a solid. This second one here, we're going to follow it down, and this would be an open. This one here, we'll follow this all the way down. This here, then this one, we'll follow it down. Open this. So let me erase my dots so that we're not overcomplicating this graph. So the distance, this isovolumic contraction phase, volume stays the same. So it's a flat line here. This isovolumic relaxation, even though the pressure is dropping significantly, the volume stays the same. So it also will be a flat line. The time between the two, this part of the graph, we see that here. This is ejection. Ejection of blood out of the heart is happening there. So that's this is what's going on here. We fill this in. So during this early part, was the ventricle filling with blood. We have this little hump right here. That's the atrial portion. The atrial does an extra little squeeze, so a little extra little hump of blood comes up there during this time. We then hit this first atrioventricular valve closure. That's here and here. Now no more blood comes in. The heart builds up pressure, but the volume stays the same, nice and flat, until the point that it opens the aortic semilunar valve. That's going to be here. And then now blood will be ejected. So there's going to be a great amount of pressure that pushes the blood out. We see on the volume graph this going down. Then that semilunar valve will close. Now the volume stays the same while the pressure is dropping. Atrioventricular valve opens, and then we refill it with new blood. Refill the ventricle. So on here, let me write our aortic. So that's our volume graph. Then let's write our aortic pressure. We'll go something like this. Comes down, hits the semilunar valve opening, rises with left ventricular pressure, drops with left ventricular pressure until the semilunar valve closes and the blood bounces off, creating this dicrotic notch, and then the pressure will then drop again. So this is our aortic pressure. As far as the electrocardiogram goes, right before this little hump here would be the P wave. So if we bring this up, we'll draw a P wave. Right at this junction where you see the AV valve closing is right where you're going to want to draw the QRS. From the peak of the ventricular pressure down to where it's going to relax, that's the only time that we actually have the T wave matching this distance. So we'll connect these lines, and now we have the appropriate timing for the electrocardiogram. So let's go to answer some of these questions. Oh, before we can, we need to label the volume. End diastolic volume, that's the end of diastole or the end of the filling phase. That is going to be the most full, match this up better, is going to be the most full that the ventricle is. So this is going to be our end diastolic volume, which we have 150 milliliters. Our end systolic volume, the emptiest the heart will be. That's going to be right down here. That's going to be 50 milliliters. So let's go over and we'll calculate stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that the heart, when it's squeezed, how much it's sent out. So stroke volume is the mathematical difference between how full it was and what's left over. So in this case, the stroke volume is going to be 100 milliliters. The cardiac output is determined by multiplying the heart rate by the stroke volume. So we write 60 beats a minute times the stroke volume, which is going to be 100 milliliters per beat. Cancel out the beats, and we end up with 6,000 milliliters per minute. You can also consider that as 6.0 liters per minute. That's the person's cardiac output. Now let's look at what's the blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure is going to match the top here. So in this graph, if this is 200, let's say it's 180. And the diastolic blood pressure is the point where the semilunar valve opens. So we'll bring this across here, and on this graph, it looks like it's 120. So you guys not too healthy, just blood pressure will be 180 over 120. So you should be able to identify all of these things from the cardiac cycle. You should be able to draw them. You should be able to extract information from these graphs and then calculate cardiac output. If you have any questions, then email me or Zoom me or let me know how I can help.